You know, I think back often to violin lessons that I had as a high school student, and I always remember my teacher lecturing me. She was so frustrated all the time, and she'd say, like, Yuki, like, why do you always get it right the second time? You know, in a concert, you only have one chance. There's no opportunity for a restart. Or I think back to the youth orchestra I played in, and you know, it was a pretty high-level youth orchestra, but we were kids, and naturally things go wrong from time to time with kids. So I was in a concert and something went wrong, and the conductor cut us off abruptly, and he turned to the audience with this mixture of shame and embarrassment and kind of anger as well, and he said, I'm so sorry, we're gonna have to restart that. So, you know, it's these kinds of experiences that have led me to associate restarts with something negative. You know, the implication that something terrible has happened, a mistake has been made, and not only that, but that I should be ashamed of that mistake, and we should, you know, sweep it under the rug, pretend like it never happened, and start all over as if it never existed. And I have a feeling, you know, in a room full of creative people that perhaps I'm not the only one who's ever felt that way. And so with all this baggage, it's no wonder that we can be so reluctant to embrace a restart, because it really would require us to come face to face with a weakness or a failure on our part. I'm a first-generation Canadian. My mom is Chinese, my dad is Japanese. And you know, for as forward-thinking and liberal and loving as my parents were and still are, I definitely, you know, was raised as a child of a tiger mom. And so, as you might imagine, acceptance of mistakes wasn't exactly a priority in our household. And so I've lived the majority of my life in an exhausting state of constantly you know, pushing forward and, you know, without looking back and giving myself much opportunity to stop and assess and take the breaths that inevitably come with the restart. But over the last few years, as you know, I've gotten a little older and responsibilities have grown and become more serious, I've been questioning the negativity around a restart and feeling that perhaps, on the contrary, in order to continue evolving as human beings, as creative people, we must come to a place of honoring and respecting the past. And that by doing so, we actually then have the freedom to restart as many times as is necessary for us to move forward. That every restart will be flavored and influenced by every previous iteration, and that we can welcome a restart without self-degradation or fear. For me as a violinist, restarting has certainly been a central theme in the practice room, but more than that, I've been coming to terms with it in the way I think of myself as an artist. The little excerpt I played a few minutes ago was from a solo piece that Bach wrote for violin. And Bach was groundbreaking for his time. He wrote several large works that have now become pillars of the repertoire for string instruments. And groundbreaking because Bach wrote solo pieces for the violin and also for the cello, instruments that are considered to be melody instruments. You know, it's the equivalent of the lead singer of a band walking out on stage and performing with no supporting guitars, no bass, no drums, nothing. Just, you know, essentially you're walking out there completely naked. So because this was so unusual in the 1700s when Bach was composing, his presence really looms over string players from a very early age. Like even in book 1 of the Suzuki method, which is commonly used to start 3- or 4-year-olds on the instrument, that book features 3 pieces by Bach in it. And his hold only becomes stronger as you progress. So with this kind of heavy pressure, you know, it's no wonder that as a student in college, I was constantly afraid to play Bach in my lessons, scared that I was playing it wrong, that I wasn't worthy of the music, that any choices I made were going to be set in stone in the history of the hundreds and thousands of violinists who had come before me. Fast forward 15 years, and turns out the solo album I released in 2016 is all Bach. I know, right? So when I was putting the album together, I had been out of school for about 6 years or so and away from the safety net of weekly approval or disapproval from my teachers and mentors. And cautiously testing out the waters of my newfound freedom, I decided to confront my so-called Bach demons. Rather than try to get it right the first time and feeling like I had one chance or bust, I started to come around to the idea that my record was going to be a snapshot of where I happened to be that day in the studio. I started to become more comfortable with the idea that the way I play Bach today will be completely different from the way I did it 10 years ago or the way I'll play it in 10 years. And that I will certainly restart my Bach interpretations many, many times after recording the album, not because of something I've done wrong, but because I've continued to evolve as an artist. So with my album, I ended up exploring this idea of restart, even in its curation. I commissioned 4 composers to write 4 responses to different Bach movements, and I paired them together on the album. It was really interesting to see how each composer confronted this task. Some chose to directly quote Bach using actual snippets of notes in the exact same order that he used them. And others chose to use harmonic or rhythmic structures as a skeleton for their new piece, but in such subtle ways that even for me, and I've lived with these pieces for a few years now, I'm always wondering, where is Bach in this? Whatever route each composer took to arrive at the finished work, they all encountered some form of restart as they drew inspiration from music that was written in 1720 and searched for its relevance in 2016. So today I thought I would play for you an excerpt from Caleb Burhan's piece, Remembrance. Caleb is one of the composers who is more overt in his homage to Bach, but even more importantly, I think he straddles the past and present so beautifully, and his music sort of swirls in a series of restarts as if the notes are in a constant search for a beginning and an end. So I'll start first with a little reminder of the original Bach piece, and then follow that with an excerpt from Caleb's. The title of my album is for Ko, and Ko is my son who turns 5 on Tuesday. And he was about 3 when the record was completed, But before I tell you too much about him, I thought I should give you a little bit of backstory. My husband and I were married on December 31st, 2012. And I remember at that time, several of my friends were going through some health issues, related to being on the birth control pill. And so, I said to Kyle, I was like, I'm going to go off the pill, but, we just got married. I don't feel ready. We're not ready to have kids, so let's just enjoy some time together. But, that means, you got to do your thing, right? It's your responsibility now, right? And he was like, yeah, okay, cool, yeah. So, 2 months later, I was pregnant. And in my 20s, I remember hanging out with friends at bars after concerts, be throwing back Maker's Marks and talking about seasoned freelancers who were no longer relevant because they had crossed over the threshold into parenthood. And we sort of scoffed at the choices they had made and vowed that we would never be like that. So when I found out I was pregnant, I lived in this constant state of low-grade panic. I was so afraid of what people would think of me, afraid that I wouldn't be taken seriously anymore, afraid that my colleagues would assume that I couldn't do my job, afraid that people would make choices for me without consulting me because they would say, oh, she has a kid now. She won't be able to do it. So I lived in total denial. Ko was born 10 weeks into my first semester as assistant professor of music here at UB. I didn't request any time off from my position because I was an untenured professor. I scheduled a solo recital 7 weeks after the baby's due date. Yeah. And remember what I said about walking out on stage naked? Yeah, it was a solo recital. I didn't even, invite any artists to join me, no support, it was just me. It's the equivalent of having some kind of death wish or something. I resumed a regular schedule of teaching and concertizing within weeks of Ko being born. And I became very adept at throwing him in a baby carrier, violin on my back, suitcase in one hand, diaper bag in the other, and trusting strangers that I found on care.com to take care of him in cities all over the world. And I think from the outside, a lot of people were like, wow, she can do it all. But for me, it was exhausting. And it was exhausting to be beholden to this narrative that I told myself every single day, that I was a failure unless I forged ahead without looking back, that if I were to stop and take a breath and restart, I was weak. So it took me about 3 years for me to finally reach a dead end. And I was tired. My marriage wasn't going that well. I was miserable at my job, and I blamed people around me for my dissatisfaction, my husband, my colleagues. But it was Ko, though, who finally forced me to realize that I needed to take responsibility for my own contentment and happiness, and that I had to let go of the fear of what other people thought of me and the fear of what I thought of myself. And Ko taught me this by being the constant in my life. When you have a little person who depends on you for their own joy, it really puts your own life into perspective. So when he was about 3, I finally stopped and allowed myself the opportunity to restart. And I feel like my career has been a series of restarts ever since. So in 2019, I resigned from my position at UB, and I put renewed energy into my solo career. My husband was off the road that year, and so I went on the road for about half the year. And I had incredible experiences. I was a soloist at the Sydney Opera House in Australia. I released my record and put together a small tour to support it. And a year after that, I began touring less, and I set my sights on a performing career that is more locally based. And a previous version of me would have seen this as settling and would have looked down on this decision, assuming, well, it's just because she has kids now, so she can't really play much. But the newer version of me was looking for a way to choose long-term contentment and balance. I took a substitute audition for the Buffalo Philharmonic when I was 8 months pregnant with my second child, Chaya. And In fact, at about 9:55 this morning, I'll be in my seat at Kleinhans, subbing with the orchestra. So thanks to all of you for starting a little bit early this morning. But my most recent career restart, and perhaps the one that means the most to me, is co-founding the nonprofit organization Buffalo String Works, or BSW for short. We offer after-school lessons to children from refugee families living on the west side of Buffalo. But more than that, through music, we offer a sense of belonging, a community, and a support for our country's newest Americans as they restart their own lives. And it is our hope that our children will experience passion and joy and be able to transfer this excitement and zeal as they grow into confident, curious, and committed individuals. BSW opened its doors 5 years ago to 17 students, and we had no idea what we were doing. It felt like we were putting fires out every single day, calling on volunteer drivers to drive kids home after every single class because there was no other way for them to get home. That is not a safe choice that we made. And at that time, I was running BSW alongside teaching at UB and concertizing, so it was one of the many things that I did. And now, 5 years later, we have 90 students in the program, and I'll become the executive director of BSW in June. And suddenly, I'm finding myself enrolled in a 3-year program through Duke University, from which I'll receive a certificate of nonprofit management. My calendar is now full of meetings with funders, with board meetings, schmoozy coffee dates. And I've worn more hats than I've ever worn in my life, from janitor, cleaning up after classes, to chauffeur for student performances, to grant writer, to administrator. And arts administration has become more and more the center of conversation at music conservatories in this country as institutions grapple with the question of what is the future of classical music. And it's a worthy conversation for sure, but when I was in school, the subtext was always, well, if you don't make it as a performer, you could always become an administrator. And so I always kind of looked down on it as with a little bit of disdain, or at the very least, well, I'll do that if I have to. And now though, maybe it's age, and maybe it's having some experience under my belt. Maybe it's the current state of our country. But I see now that becoming an administrator could be the way that I can actually make an impact on our community and on our city. Prior to BSW, I never felt a connection or commitment to any place that I lived. I was just passing through, knowing that it was a stop along the way. But my work with Buffalo String Works has grounded me and provided me with a sense of belonging. And Buffalo has suddenly become my home and my city. And I've met so many inspiring people because of BSW. Just me standing here this morning is because BSW had the honor of being CreativeMornings Changemaker in February. And with BSW, it's truly a privilege to be an administrator. I'm in awe of our families every single day. The bravery and courage they show on a daily basis just to step outside of their homes. The courage to overcome huge barriers, language barriers, cultural barriers, ethnic, religious barriers. Some of our parents were political prisoners in their home countries. Many of our children have seen terrible tragedies that most of us in this room could never even begin to imagine. So when I think of all that our BSW families have endured, I think to myself, what right do I have to be so afraid of a restart? Just last month, I played on a concert on a local series here in town, and the presenter, who's very familiar with my work at BSW as well as a violinist, he said, Yuki, oh, you really sounded so great. We've got to get you playing more. I hate to see you languish. And of course, I realized he meant it as a compliment. But, it's those casual words that can lodge so deeply within a person's subconscious that we can unintentionally hinder growth and creativity in each other. And so, I finished today asking us all here not only to support, but to celebrate each other's restarts. Because by shedding fear and judgment of ourselves and of each other, we will truly become a community that continues to evolve, to be creative, and to reach a place of greater mutual understanding and compassion.